Good morning and welcome to this webinar. Hi, my name is Kevin Wong and I'm the director of the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park, which is the educational program of the Joshua Tree National Park Association. Before we get started, I'd like to offer some tips on how to use this webinar effectively. As internet bandwidth is heavily used in California due to the stay-at-home direction, and so many of us are working remotely, we may have issues with internet connection. If you have audio or monitor issues during this webinar, it may be due to having too many programs open, including your email or Facebook, which have regular updates. These will reduce your access to bandwidth. In addition, when the webinar begins, you will see a small control panel on your screen. There's a question mark and a dialogue balloon. If you click on the question mark, you can submit questions that we will present to the speaker during her presentation. At this time, we will begin. Today's presentation is Fire in the Mojave, Stories from the Deserts and Mountains of Inland Southern California with Ruth Nolan. Ruth, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to Fire on the Mojave, Stories from the Deserts and Mountains of Inland Southern California. I'm your presenter. I'm a professor at College of the Desert and a former wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service and BLM, Bureau of Land Management, California Desert District. I'd like to also note that I've included my email. It's ruthnolan13@gmail.com. If you would like to reach out to me during or after the webinar to follow through, I'd be happy to be connected with you. What is Fire on the Mojave? Stories from the Deserts and Mountains of Inland Southern California. I started the project in 2015 based in part on my own experiences and background working as a seasonal wildland firefighter during the 1980s and increasingly becoming aware that there seemed to be a need for public education, for community inclusive forums, just sort of a learning platform, both based on my own experiences on field research, academic research, and more, to help connect the public to the pressing issue of wildfires, which is a very, very ongoing and very real thing for those of us who live in Southern California, and especially including the deserts, which many people don't think much about. Supported to date by grants from College of the Desert, California Writers Residency 1888 Center, Phi Kappa Phi Honorary Society, and to date, in addition to today's webinar, I've presented for the 29 Palms Schoolhouse Museum, the Wrightwood Historical Society, the Inlandia Institute, Mojave Historical Society, High Desert Museum, Yucca Valley, Palm Springs Library, College of the Desert, and previously a different version of this presentation for the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park. The project is ongoing. It's sort of an organically growing, always developing project that ideally, in the end, there will probably be no end to the project, but I'd like to publish a book of my project findings made available to organizations and the public as an educational tool, as well as to continue to add to my Facebook page, Fire on the Mojave, give lectures, gather community stories, and more. So the goals are to gather field research, academic research, and oral interviews, facilitate community forums, provide educational tools, compile a comprehensive archival bibliography of wildfire-centric writing and other resources made available to organizations and the public. And this is already available. I have quite an extensive bibliography generated for anybody who's interested. Additional sources in today's webinar are credited to the Joshua Tree National Park website. California has experienced a multiple unprecedented large-scale wildfire events in the past 2 decades, including in the inland Southern California mountain and desert regions. So we've all heard undoubtedly about the Camp Fire of 2018 that burned through the town of Paradise, California, claiming many lives and basically decimating the town. We also may have heard of the Mendocino Complex Fire in Northern California of 2018, which is the largest wildfire event in the state of California to date at 460,000 acres. In addition, we've had the Thomas Fire of 2017-18 in Southern California, burning 282,000 So major wildfire events are definitely on the increase. So the photo we're looking at are the remains of the 70,000 acre hackberry fire in the East Mojave Preserve. June 2005, I'm sorry, this is actually the East Mojave National Park at this point. Juniper, Joshua, pinyon woodlands at varying elevations have recovered very poorly, or we should say they have not really recovered very well, and most likely are permanently altered from former lush conditions. So that's what we're looking at in this slide. Many people don't realize if they come to visit Joshua Tree National Park, they just don't understand that Joshua Tree National Park is a very flammable, definitely in the wilderness wildfire burn zone. So here's talking about some of the major events of the last 2 decades in SoCal. This is a NASA generated image of the massive multiple fire event in Southern California back in October 2007. So you can see all the different fires burning and how big they were, because the smoke could be seen from outer space. Even down into Mexico, there were fires. The last few years in our region, here are some of the big fire events that have resulted in entire towns being evacuated. 2016, the Blue Cut Fire, the entire town of Wrightwood evacuated. And this fire, interestingly, started in the Chaparral Zone in Cajon Pass to the south, and fueled by winds, actually burned far out into the Mojave Desert and towards the northern end, as you can see with my cursor here. So this fire transverse, as many wildfires in our zone do, they don't just start in the mountains and stay there. This started in the Chaparral Zone, part of it burned up into the forest, and a lot of it burned out into the high desert, the Mojave Desert region, which is very similar terrain to the Morongo Basin near Joshua Tree. The mountain fire of 2013 up in the San Jacinto Wilderness, which is on this south of the south end of Joshua Tree National Park. The entire town of Idlewild evacuated 19,400 acres, and the entire town was again evacuated with another major fire in 2016, the Cranston Fire. You might ask, how did I get interested in the topic? Well, I've already mentioned that I started out as a young adult, college age, looking for work, and just stumbled into working for the Mojave Greens fire crew based out of Victor Valley, which is about a 1-hour drive from Joshua Tree. This is what I remember most vividly from my firefighting days, the mopping up after the last of the fire had gone to bed. So here I am doing some relatively lightweight, something called mopping up in a fire that was up near Big Bear back in the early 1980s. So the Mojave Greens is a crew that is based out of the United States Forest Service, San Bernardino National Forest. And I went on to work on that crew for several summer seasons and went on to then be hired by the Bureau of Land Management, California Desert District Flight Crew. Worked on a hotshot crew as well as the station engine. And here's a photograph of Helicopter 554 in 1987, the Apple Valley, California fire station. There I am. Flight crew. And part of my project to date is publishing some standalone articles that will eventually be chapters in the book Fire on the Mojave. So this is just a little page from an article called A Hot Clean Burn, Fire on the Mojave, published in the Desert Report in September 2016, and a different incarnation of this article was published recently in the Desert Magazine out of the Desert Sun newspaper. So I'll just read just a little bit of this. In the beginning, they laid a woman, Ninmawat palm, on her back, took a wooden spindle and drilled her. First blood, then fire came forth. This woman then became a palm tree. From Tamalpaq, Cahuilla Indian Knowledge and Usage of Plants, co-authored by Dr. Lowell Bean and Catherine Siva Sabel. It's a very windy March afternoon, and I've just driven into Joshua Tree National Park. A sign by the road catches my eye. Fire danger today moderate. Perfect. As I drive into the park, I'm surrounded by craggy, boulder-riddled vistas and, of course, the ubiquitous Joshua trees. I'm stunned by the colors of spring wildflowers popping up everywhere along the roadside. Fields of yellow desert dandelions, sultry pink sand verbena, iridescent purple lupin have turned the usually tan-colored desert expanses into a beautiful symphony of color and passing beauty. Even the Joshua trees themselves are tipped with fat white blossoms at the outermost reaches of their thick-thorned crowns. It's hard to concentrate on driving with all of this beauty surrounding me. But I'm not here to see the wildflowers of this year's so-called super bloom, spawned by last October monsoon rains and a favorable early January rainfall. I'm not here to rock climb or camp or marvel at the wonderland of rocks. I'm here to look for evidence of desert wildfire, to find evidence of some of the major fire events that have occurred here in recent years, and to see up close the scars they've left behind. Soon enough, I get lucky. I see a break in the thick groves of giant Joshua trees that the road cuts through. Then I see one of the rare pullouts along the road. I pull over and park next to a metal kiosk that says, Memorial Fire, May 27th to 30th, 1999. According to the kiosk, 14,000 acres burned here for 3 days, ignited by a passing afternoon thunderstorm, making this a major Mojave Desert wildfire event. I've struck wildfire gold. I'm the only car that stopped here, and I don't blame others for racing by. This grotesquely transformed desert scene isn't what most visitors have come to the park to see. In the distance are healthy, thriving, blossoming Joshua trees, with one of the park's small mountain ranges behind. But in front of me is the old burn zone with only a few wildflowers and what looks uncannily like large human or animal limbs strewn about. They're the trunks and limbs of Joshua trees that burned and fell apart in the fire all those years ago. And it was very interesting when I actually took the time to do the field research to look for a wildfire in the park. I had driven by that site so many times in the last 3 or 4 decades in all of my years of living in the Mojave Desert and going to Joshua Tree National Park. And I had never really once noticed that burn zone. And so sometimes the evidence of wildfires that have happened in the desert, unless you had actually seen the terrain before what it looked like, you may not even notice there was a fire because the desert does tend to look sort of a little more empty than other landscapes to most people. Just very quickly, what are the basic components of every wildfire? Oxygen, heat, and fuel. So here in Southern California, we have lots of the heat and we have lots of the fuel. This is one thing that makes one of the components that makes our area quite so flammable. We also have other factors, fuels, depending on moisture content. So if we have a hot, dry day with low humidity in the air, we are going to have the plants also become more dried out as the moisture in the air fluctuates. Vertical arrangement, we have a lot of mountains and hills. So when we got a lot of steep hills in our region, fires burn very beautifully up hills. The size and shape of the hills, the continuity, and basically what we call the fire regime of what kinds of plants are growing in that area. Weather has a big role in wildfires. Wind speed, we have a lot of wind in the high desert, so that definitely is a big factor in spreading our wildfires. Again, low humidity, precipitation tends to be low. In the summer, we have sometimes lightning storms, which do start a lot of fires in the Mojave Desert. Once again, topography, steepness of slope, position of slope. The shape of the country, we have a lot of box canyon, narrow or wide canyons, ridges, mixed in with flat terrain, and just a lot of fuel. So one of the goals of Mojave Fire in the Mojave is to focus on historical influences and relationships between wildfire and the human geographic, biologic, botanic environments in our inland desert and mountain regions, including long-term wildfire after effects and emerging influences such as climate change. And I would like to add also the really sharp increase in the presence of human beings, both visiting the desert, spending time in the desert, and even moving to the deserts. This is a photograph of myself with my daughter Tara some years ago, going to visit an old burn zone up in the San Bernardino Mountains, an area mixed with juniper and pinyon trees, as well as Joshua trees. This was about 10 years after this fire, and this area had all been heavily forested with Joshua's pinyons and juniper and other plants, and you can just see how even 10 years later there was only a little tiny bit of growth coming back. Another goal is to serve as an accessible educational resource to stimulate in community inclusive discourse, preparedness, and understanding of the presence of wildfire in our region. So we are never going to get away from wildfires. They are part of where we live. The more we understand, the better perhaps we can be prepared. This is at the Pinion Bureau of Land Management fire station, and this is one of the firefighters with my grandson, Simon. And I took him on one of the field research trips I took, and just wanted to get him kind of starting to think about wildfire, playing here with an old volunteer fire hose. One of the goals of the project is to learn from the crucial centuries-long relationship between our region's Native American people, Cahuilla, Chemehuevi, Serrano, and other tribes, and the role of wildfire in the sustainability of natural resources. So one of the great reading books I recommend is by M. Kat Anderson called Tending the Wild. She has done an amazing amount of research, sometimes with Dr. Lowell Bean and others, in helping to convey how did our area's Native Americans not only just deal with wildfire, but how did they deliberately sometimes actually burn certain areas to keep the landscape healthier, make it less flammable. And I think we have a lot to learn from turning to these types of sources. The wilderness-urban interface. So we talk about this bit about people being smashed up into the burn zones. When you look at this house here up in the area called Pinion, up near the Santa Rosa Mountains, up Highway 74 south of Palm Desert, you get a good idea of what we're talking about. More and more people are building their homes in the wilderness-urban interface. This is where people are actually living right in the wilderness, but they're bringing urban types of settlements in there, which is one of the reasons why we hear about more loss of property and even life in these wildfire events, because simply more people are living in these areas. So another Native American perspective from one of our Cahuilla tribal members, a resident of the Cahuilla Indian Reservation, the Santa Rosa Mountain. The aftermath of wildfire takes years to overcome and can be devastating to the landscapes, which can be harmful to the environment in many ways, such as the use of fire retardant in pristine areas. There are times when the terrains are thick and inaccessible by those working their best to put them out. As for the local Native community, we are affected as we still live off the land, and plant use is still very important to our Cahuilla way of life. Roseanne Hamilton. And Cahuilla Serrano cultural leader, Ernest Siba, when I went to visit him to talk about my project, he had given some very interesting cultural information about the role of Cahuilla people in maintaining the palm tree oasis here in the Palm Springs area, as well as up in the national park. And for example, at 49 Palms Oasis and 29 Palms Oasis, these oasis palm tree communities actually benefit from occasional burns. As he kept saying, it's like somebody would be designated to burn the groves out to keep them clean of pestilence, and the plants would regenerate, a very interesting type of desert plant that actually does well with fire, and because their shallow roots or their feet are in water at all times, they regenerate quite quickly and regrow. And once again, Native American wildfire regimes historically kept resources healthy for Cahuilla and other tribes. Another goal is to showcase the men and women who fight wildfire in our region, fire agencies and firefighters. And this is a young man called Brian Scott, a United States Forest Service firefighter, discussing his most memorable wildfire assignments. So I asked him, like, out of your career of 10 years, what are the things that really stand out? So he made a list. One of them was the time we almost had to get into our fire shelters, or the time we barely made it out of a burn zone, the time we almost got hit with a dump of water from a helicopter, and more. And here are some crew members from the Black Rock Bureau of Land Management Interagency Fire Station at Yucca Valley, preparing for the 2019 fire season. So this is a fire crew that works in close conjunction with the national park there to manage fires and be among the first responders, as well as some of the city crews and other types of fire agencies in the region. Who else fights fires? Usually when we see the news, they're always interviewing, and I have a little beef with this, like it's always some big strapping guy. They rarely show women on the crew. And they typically do not show anybody of color on the, it's always a white man. No offense to white men, but I've always wondered about that, because when I've worked on fire lines even years ago, we're seeing people from all different walks of life and diversity and ethnicities. So one of the really wonderful things about firefighting as a career or as a job is that here we have a couple of young men that were formerly incarcerated in the California Youth Authority. I interviewed this young man, Royal Ramey, who's from the inner city in Los Angeles, and had started out getting into gangs and just going down the wrong track. And he gained some traction in starting to work on fire crews, to the point where he went through the Victor Valley College Public Safety Academy, worked on the Mojave Greens crew, and is now working seasonally as on a fire engine out of fawn skin up in the mountains. And I wanted to give a nod to the wonderful San Bernardino Forest Fire Captain Betty Ash, who is an African-American woman and served for many years coordinating the Mojave Greens crew. I worked with her years ago when I was on the crew, and she has recently retired and has been based in Joshua Tree for some time. I'm not sure if she's still there, but she's had a phenomenal career, and we just often don't see women represented. Here's another young man from the Coachella Valley, Wayne Seacrest, who went through the College of the Desert Public Safety Academy and now works at the Palm Springs Airport Fire Station, which also responds to wildfires in the area. We have all kinds of people that are ready to fight fire when it breaks out in our region. And here are some guys that live up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. And they actually started their own volunteer fire station for the San Bernardino National Forest, the Rattlesnake Mountain area of critical environmental concern. So they actually have an engine and some facilities to help be among the first responders to fires in this remote area. Another thing that I'd like to point out in my project is the number of incarcerated men and women from 43 fire camps across California who do a bulk of the wildland firefighter suppression in our state in the Western US, making far less per hour than people hired by the Forest Service or BLM or other agencies. It's interesting to note that in our region was among one of the first to pioneer wildfire training, modern contemporary wildfire techniques and strategies. So the San Bernardino Forest actually had some experimental stations to do so. And we look back at how basic and raw the firefighting technology was back in the 1950s, was definitely not where it is today. And definitely these guys on the crew don't seem to have a lot of good safety gear. So thanks to some of this experimental stuff, we have the technology and the strategies and safety measures that we have today. Another goal is to showcase our region's community college wildland fire training programs. These play an important role in training young adults for careers in wildland firefighting. Students can get their community college degree and also get on-the-job training, which helps lead to jobs. So in our region, we have College of the Desert, Victor Valley College in Victorville, and Copper Mountain College up in the Morongo Basin, all have public safety academies, and they play a really important role in training. So here's a crew at Victor Valley College doing some practice hose lays. Here's a young woman. I was really impressed. She was the only woman in the College of the Desert PSA class of 2016. And I was like, yeah, there's a woman in this crew here. This is great. She's going to go on to a career in firefighting. The 10 standard firefighting orders, a vintage sign that's a little blurry. I apologize for this, but the 10 standard firefighting orders have basically not changed in all these decades. And every firefighter, including me, has these memorized because they're all very important and your life can depend on them. Fire behavior, safety, and operations control. Fight fire aggressively, but provide for safety first. And here's another photo of the College of the Desert Academy students practicing working in a fire line, all geared up. Wildfire suppression demonstration, family night PSA at the Roy Wilson Training Center, Thousand Palms, California, down here in the Coachella Valley. And this is retired City of Palm Springs Fire Chief Scott Ventura teaching wildland fire course at College of the Desert. So wildland firefighters get a mix of a lot of training, book training, academic training, but they also have obviously a lot of on-the-job training as well. And here's some of the tools that are used by hand crews, wildfire crews. Shovels, a tool called the Pulaski, the two-headed axe, and a tool called a McCloud that has, it looks like a big giant rake with a sharp blade on one side, as well as chainsaws and other tools. Another goal is to gather citizen and firefighter stories of those who have lived through wildfire events. And let me tell you, everybody who lives in Southern California has a fire story. So these are amazing. I've collected quite a few of those and would plan to showcase those just as a standalone feature at some point, maybe for a public reading or even a short book of collected stories. One of the biggest fire events in memory is the Sawtooth Fire affecting the high desert in and around Joshua Tree National Park, actually not right in the park, but in the area, a complex of fires that broke out and eventually merged, burning through a lot of Pioneer Town and other areas, and causing a lot of loss of buildings. And it just really devastated the community. And if you drive up in these areas north of Yucca Valley, you can see the desert is just really not what it was in terms of vegetation and Joshua trees. Lightning strike, 61,700 acres. There was one death on this fire, 17 injuries. A lot of buildings and vehicles were lost. And here's a photograph of the fire burning from mountains to Chaparral down into the desert. It burned over several days and was just basically a very horrifying event. The Sawtooth Complex. So this is a great little book written by local desert writer Susan Lang, who was commissioned by the Arizona Commissioner of the Arts, of all things, who wrote a little book on the Sawtooth Complex, basically telling the story. And this is a great book if you're interested in reading more about this event. Another story I gathered was from Morongo Reservation Fire Captain Efrain Vargas, who was a first responder on the very tragic Esperanza Fire of 2006, which started down in the Banning Pass and burned up over into the mountains and tragically claimed the lives of 5 firefighters from the Idlewild engine crew. So he was telling the story of what it was like to work on that fire and pointing to where the fire had burned. And John McLean is a really great writer who has done a number of investigative stories and books on major wildfire events that have happened in the Western US in recent decades. So this is a great read if you wanted to read an investigative, very gripping, very heartbreaking, and very, very looking into all of what happened, what made this fire happen, you know, why were these lives lost, the Esperanza Fire, arson, murder, and the agony of Engine 57. John McLean, it must be noted, is the son of the famous American writer Norman McLean, who wrote a really classic wildland fire book called Young Men and Fire. So if you want to really dig in and read about, you know, big time historic wildfires, The Young Men and Fire is really an amazing book also to read. And there is a plaque at the Victor Valley College PSA. Several of these young men went through that program and had lost their lives in the Esperanza Fire. So this was, I thought, a very nice memorial to them for their service and commemorating, you know, their lives. They gave their lives for the job. Another goal in the project is education. Once again, how can we and should we prepare for wildfire events in our region? So a man named Richard Halsey is a tireless resource for all things wildfire in Southern California. He has written a great book called Fire, Chaparral, and Survival in Southern California. Was inspired to do so by his own experiences in some of the big fires in San Diego back in 2003. He also runs an organization called the Chaparral Institute, which he publishes quite a few articles, investigation about chaparral terrain and the fire regimes, fire ecologies, and he's just an endless font of resources. So I would totally recommend this book and checking out his website. Excuse me. CAL FIRE is the California state, kind of the main gathering ground for all things wildfire and other types of fire as well, city fires. Like wilderness urban interface fires that burn between towns and wilderness areas affecting people and nature. So this is a great resource. If you want to find out how many fires are going on in California at any given time, you click on incidents. You can learn about wildfires. They have resources to help you, grants for communities to be fire prepared, and much more. They have one link here, wildfire is coming, are you ready? So I totally recommend checking out this website. They even have an app you can turn to, and they will give you up-to-date text on wildfire incidents in your area, how to make your your property a little more fire safe, and so forth. So here's their website, and there are publications available for purchase, and this is a great one. A little bit technical. This is something that people in the fire profession would be reading and using as a resource, but I find this to be really helpful if you're really, like me, very interested in the topic. So Wilderness Urban Interface Operating Principles. Homeowner wildfire preparation, clearing of flammable blanket fuels. So just up the mountain from where I live in Palm Desert, terrain that is very similar to areas of Yucca Valley and Joshua Tree and in the national park there, we see that homeowners, some of them have really tried to be prepared for fires. So if we look at how they've cleared out the ground, at least 6 to 8 feet high down to mineral soil, if and when a fire does burn through their area, it will not burn as quickly and become as devastating because it will peter out when it hits the soil. This is not going to protect them 100%. A lot of fires get going. They have spot fires, and in some cases, there's just not much you can do to prevent loss of property. But this is a defense, and it is a useful defense that will help to protect their property and lives. So I apologize for the graphic. This is not a very good image, but this is just one quick shot of what it looks like to consider clearing out the areas around your house if you are living up in the Joshua Tree area, Yucca Valley, and so forth. And this is a group called the California Fire Safe Council, another wonderful resource to turn to for just, I'm living in the mountains. I moved to Joshua Tree. How do I think ahead about protecting myself and my home from fire? So another goal of my project, to share wildfire ecology resource. Why do wildfire incidents continue to increase in frequency and devastation to the environment and human lives? So this is a photo from the Memorial Fire burn that I read about just earlier in this presentation. These are actually the limbs of Joshua trees that didn't survive the fire. And as you can see in the background, just barely, this is a really healthy Joshua tree forest. So the area in the foreground at one time was as rich with Joshua trees. So 20 years later, this has not recovered. This area just burned, and it's just basically going to be a wasteland. The Joshua trees will not be able to come back because they do not regenerate well after fires. So there's a little plaque there at the site, and this is what it looks like there 21 years later. I actually took these photos, of course, before the park was closed here during the pandemic, but you get the idea of 20 years later, this is just not what it used to be, and it will never be what it used to be. Another area of burn zones in our higher elevations where we have different types of extremely flammable fuels, the Pinyon fire up in the mountains behind Palm Desert, which in some ways does resemble the ecology, the topography, the mixed plant life and so forth. It's very similar. So you can look here, you see the fingers in the distance of where the fire of 1994 took out the pinyon forest. And you can still see the scars from that. The pinyon forest has recovered poorly, and according to anthropologist Daniel McCarthy, the area will probably never flourish again because of the conditions that are necessitated for the pinyon trees to regenerate. The whole fire just burned so much that there was nothing left to regenerate. This is a really tragic loss of that habitat. So we take a look at the park, the fire history of Joshua Tree National Park from 1967 to 2012. Excuse me. All these little flames are fires. One thing a lot of people are surprised to learn that I know as a former firefighter, but the public doesn't usually know, is how many fires really break out in our region, like especially during fire season, that people never hear about because they're small and they get put out before they become big or threaten or become devastating. And many of the fires in the park historically have been started by lightning during the summer and monsoon seasons of the fall. So if you look at all these, we see a lot of fires. And of course, there have been bigger fires that have been more devastating. So little fires are happening all the time in the desert during fire season. We just don't usually hear about them. So here's some information in the next number of slides coming from the Joshua Tree National Park website talking about wildfire in the park. So this photograph is not in Joshua Tree National Park, but it's similar terrain. I took the photo up in a little bit north in the Mojave in an area near Sema Dome. So this nice mix of really healthy Joshua tree forest mixed in with juniper. This is a feature that's found in a lot of the Mojave Desert at higher elevations. So even small shrubs like blackbrush may require 50 years to come back to pre-fire densities. We have problems with native grasses, non-native grasses. That's a really big problem in the desert. The invasive species of grasses that grow up like grass, they are grass, and then they dry out and they help to fuel fires, making them much more damaging. So the key to managing fire in the park is understanding how the wildfires affect vegetation in the desert environment. Biologists are monitoring the long-term consequences of fire in the desert ecosystems. And what can we learn? What can we do to actually help the areas heal from these fires? This picture I took up in the East Mojave National Preserve that is part of that hackberry fire, which you saw a picture of earlier. And this area, I remember going here in the 1980s, and it was a lush area, lush with pinyon trees, junipers, even some Joshua trees. And this fire burned in 2004. And this is what it looked like 2 years ago. So it's like, to me, it just looks like a wasteland compared to what it used to look like. It doesn't even look like the same place. So unfortunately, fire is a natural process. Joshua Tree National Park has endured centuries of lightning-caused fires. But like I said earlier, the difference is that fires in this area used to be limited because the shrubs and trees were widely spaced and the invasive grasses were not there to fuel it up and make it burn much worse. Human activities are also contributing to increased frequency and severity. So you have more people out and about, more campers, more human-caused fires, all adding to this mix of just not a good mix when it comes to protecting our regions in the desert here. The park maintains records of fires going back to 1945. Most occurred between May 18th and September 20th when the desert vegetation was very dry. 74% were caused by lightning and 26% were human caused. The number and intensity of lightning fires has increased over the past 50 years, according to park records. So before 1965, most of the lightning fires burned less than 1/4 acre. After that, more large fires and frequent fires have been recorded. In 1979, the Quail Mountain Fire burned 6,000 acres. In 1995, the Covington Fire burned 5,158 acres. 1999, the largest fire in Joshua Tree's history, the Juniper Complex Fire, burned 13,894 acres of slow-growing California junipers, pinyon pine, and Joshua trees. So definitely scientists are looking at this, fire ecologists, why are these fires burning hotter and worse? And many people are attributing, there is evidence showing that the desert is getting hotter. We're having more record heat days, more consecutive hot days, attributing to the factors of climate change. So that's another problem that's in the mix. Most fires in the park are started by natural causes, but now they spread faster and burn more intensely because of the introduction of the non-native plant species. So when they dry out, once again, these non-natives just fuel the fires and make them burn hotter and worse. So you can see here in the Memorial Fire burn, even 20 years later, I could still walk up to this burned out Joshua tree and the soot inside this tree was still there. Like I could rub my fingers in it. So you think this is 20 years later. If this was an area probably in the East Coast, it would have grown back and healed better, but this is not going to heal here. And it's going to take a very long time even to decay. So some of the Joshua trees can make it, but if they don't, it's because They're affected by drought and rodents and insects, and they just can't survive these fires. But some of the trees in this memorial fire burn did make it. They were able to come back to some extent. This is a very hardy tree here that's obviously burned at the top, but it's still alive and making it. One more picture of that scene. Another concern is the sharp increase in the number of visitors. Once again, population, visitors to the park, to the adjacent desert communities. Generally, the more people you have in a fire zone, the fires are going to go up for whatever causes. And very quickly, here towards the end of my presentation, just once again want to note that the fire regime for the palm tree communities in and around Joshua Tree National Park and the Mojave Desert are very different than some of the other areas. So this is the Corn Springs in the eastern Riverside County, and this area had the palm tree oasis had experienced a fire, but the trees are coming back. And this is actually my dog Brindle. We went out to take a look at that a few years ago. Dos Palmas Preserve, which is south of the Joshua Tree National Park, we see many palm tree oases of the native fan palms, the Washingtonian fan palms. The trunk of the tree is burned, but the tree is still alive and it's flourishing. So these trees are very fire adapted because they sit right on top of water sources that are pushed up by earthquake fault zones. They're able to regenerate and survive. And some interesting side effects of wildfires in the desert. The site of the Green Hill fire in 2015, South Zone California Desert District. This site, it burned a whole bunch of really dense brush and it revealed a previously unknown archaeology site. So sometimes wildfires provide interesting clues to archaeology in the past. A mixed recovery also at the Green Hill fire site. The landscape is very slow to recover because this is not necessarily palm tree oasis. It's just an area that has probably water not too far below the surface, but different brush and different plants growing there. But this laid back to reveal some very interesting archaeology. The Western jay is a species of bird that actually flourishes quite well after wildfires. And I think this plucky bird's survival could be a really interesting study all on its own to find out how do they do so well in the aftermath of the fires. And of course, we often see following wildfires, especially up towards the mountains, that we will have a flourishment of wildflowers and certain plants growing, just not the ones that got burned following the fire. The lower end of Pushwalla Canyon, just outside of Joshua Tree National Park boundaries. The palm oasis has healed from a fire, but you can tell that some of the trees probably won't come back because they got pretty torched. And I just want to add that unlike some species of forest trees, such as redwoods, we've all probably heard that some plants actually do need fire in order to regenerate, but the majority of desert plants, desert ecology, do not need fire. They do not do well after fire. So just to make that distinction. Fire season's upon us. Be careful, be prepared. Smokey Bear is telling us. And my final slide is a picture of me visiting the BLM Apple Valley Fire Station, holding a Pulaski tool, which I put many hours in working with that tool. And if you have questions, this is not my old fire engine, but it's the new version of the fire engine I worked on one season there. So thank you for listening, and I just hope you found my discussion interesting and help you stimulate you to think about wildfire in our desert regions, to be more careful, to learn more, and to be prepared.
Thank you, Ruth. I have unmuted all the audience members if you want to ask some questions, but you will have to go up to the control panel and unmute yourself individually if you have any questions to ask of Ruth at this point in time. So please feel free to ask any questions. I have our observation, Ruth, that the Oasis of Mara in 29 Palms suffered a fire last year. Unfortunately, it was an arson fire. Many of the palm trees were burnt. Some have survived, and a few others appear that they're not going to survive. It's a sad fact that human interaction with nature does cause many of our fires.
Yes, thank you for your input. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a really another example of the increase of humans in the desert areas and also other areas in Southern California that are in the wilderness. Definitely not everybody's going to the desert with appreciation and care and respect and caring for the desert. And arson is definitely a very common cause of fires. And yeah, I've seen the site, I've seen the trees that were burned, and another example of an area burning so hot and fast because of the invasive grasses in that area, and also some possibility that the water sources for the Oasis of Mara are shifting a bit and may not be providing as much water as they were at one time to keep those growths going and flourishing. So you just throw deliberate fire, and usually arsonists always know when the fire danger is the highest, like they're just tuned into that. So they're going to pick the day when the winds are up and the humidity is really down. You know, it's just sad and tragic. And thank you for your input. Just reminding us all of how careful we need to be with fire in the desert.
Well, Ruth, thank you for being here today, and thank you to our audience. This afternoon's webinar will be with Candace Weber on the topic of how to identify animal burrows. Until then, please stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.